This podcast is brought to you by JAM, Junction Arts and Media, building community in the Upper Valley through media.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Going to Dismas. I'm your host, Jeff Backus, and today we have a very special episode. We've deviated from our typical programming involving resident stories and former residents and volunteers, and today we have with us some very special guests that are going to speak to the history of Dismas of Vermont and Dismas in general. We're going to go around the table, and if you could just briefly introduce yourselves.
My name is Jim Curran. I am the Executive Director of Dismas of Vermont.
I'm Rita McCaffrey, and I'm a volunteer with Hartford Dismas House and help out at the other houses.
And also has a title still in the organization, the founder of Dismas of Vermont, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so that needed to be pointed out, I think. And I'm Richard Gagne. I'm a house director and program manager for Dismas. I am a house director in the Burlington area with Dismas since we started in Vermont.
All right, so I think in order to do this, we have to go back to the beginning. Rita, at what point did the concept of Dismas of Vermont enter your head?
Dismas of Vermont came after working as a volunteer with prisoners in Rutland and then in other facilities, training volunteers to teach decision-making and problem-solving to the prisoners. And we were invited to go to Memphis, Tennessee, my husband and I, to put on a decisions training for volunteers down there. It was my husband's friend from St. Michael's College, Art Curran, who invited us. He was the one who also invited me to take the training in decisions back because they had gone to St. Mike's together, and he was very involved in Albany at that time. He became a Dominican priest, and he was located in Memphis. So my husband and I went down in 1981, and this training also had other people from Tennessee who came to the training. One was Jack Hickey, and the other was Terry Horgan. And Jack Hickey, along with Vanderbilt students, originated the first Dismas House in 1974 with the students from Vanderbilt.
Richard and Rita, you both actually met Father Jack Hickey, who created the Dismas concept and model. He
was extremely involved with us. My husband and I went to a national conference for volunteers in criminal justice in Nashville in 1983. Our friend Art Curran said, you should look up at Jack Hickey at Dismas House. And so we called him, and he brought us to the Nashville Dismas House. We had dinner there. It was an amazing program. And I have to be perfectly honest and say we walked away thinking that the decisions program was what we did and had no idea that we would ever do a Dismas House in Vermont.
So all of the houses here in Vermont, Hartford, Burlington, Rutland, we all have a Father Jack Hickey Award given to somebody in the community who's gone above and beyond to give back. What do you remember? What do you know about Jack Hickey at the person? What's his story?
Well, frankly, I don't know a whole lot about his story. I know he was from Fall River, Massachusetts, right around the same time that we were starting a Dismas House, in Vermont. He was working with a group of people in the Worcester area. So that was for him like close to home. But I don't know, to me, like I said, I don't really know too much of his story, but he was a chaplain at Vanderbilt University in the 70s. And so sort of the origin story of Dismas is, and obviously this is what we were told, 10 years later, when we were getting involved. But, Father Jack had organized Vanderbilt University students to go into the Tennessee State Prison, which was this huge, 2,000 men fortress type, old time prison, like you see in the movies, right? So they went in as volunteers. And they did things that volunteers might typically do in a prison, help people with literacy and things like that, maybe played some sports, basketball. But they also spent some time, I remember them saying they had these Friday night rap sessions. And back then rap meant a discussion. It had nothing to do with music. And
Might have been more fun if it did.
Yeah. So these university students from Vanderbilt, right, are getting to know men who were in prison there. And as they got to know men, they recognized for some men, when it was time for them to get out of prison, they had a home to go to. And if they had a home, that probably also meant that there was family there, right? Because if you think about it, if you're in prison for a couple of years, if you were living by yourself, you don't have any place to go when you get out of prison. But if you were living with family, then there's a place to go because your family is continuing to live wherever, right? So, and they saw that worked out pretty well for the most part in terms of people leaving prison, going home, and wouldn't see them come back. And they also recognized at the same time, there was this other group of men who, for whatever reason, didn't have those two things, a place to go or family that would be there to support them as they transitioned out of prison. So they thought, well, what if we could find a place where we could live ourselves so that like this house that we get could be like the home that they don't have. And if some of us are living there, we could be like the family that they don't have that's kind of giving them support. So, Father Jack was an amazing preacher, right? Dominicans are known for their preaching, and he was one of the best. So he raised a bunch of money. They purchased this rundown old house in downtown Nashville, actually on 16th Avenue South, which is, interestingly enough, Music Row. But they were kind of farther out from the city center. So anyway, they fixed up the house. It's a beautiful old house. And these Vanderbilt students started living there and invited men to come live with them. And then about a year after that, they said, well, women coming out of prison would have the same need. So they incorporated women. So basically then Dismas House was a place where men and women, university students, lived together with men and women coming out of prison and creating this sense of family-like community. So one of the things they did was eat dinner together. And they did evening meals 7 nights a week. And they had volunteers that they invited from the wider community to come in, prepare meals, stay and eat with them, so that they became a part of that family community as well.
Now, would you say having the students and former prisoners living together happened like incidentally? That wasn't the original plan. They were just people. You just found two populations that needed housing and family. They didn't say let's tap into Vanderbilt and let's put these two people together. Maybe they're good resources. It was just kind of based on need.
They were already visiting the prisoners, and Jack Hickey and the students moved into the house,
right,
and began welcoming, the people coming out of prison. So it just evolved naturally, I guess you would say.
In a sense, I think, it was the students with Father Jack, obviously, but it was the students who started Dismas House, who created Dismas House. So they were not an afterthought or somebody thought, well, this is the way I like to put it. It wasn't like a sociology professor at Vanderbilt who did a bunch of, research and then, using the 1970s models of evidence-based practices, decided, hey, if we take this part of our population, university students, and this other part of our population, prisoners or former prisoners, and we put them together in the house and, do some social engineering and voila, we create, we create reconciliation or reintegration out of that. It wasn't that technical or that thought through, or, it wasn't that sophisticated.
Right.
But basically, to me, the genius of Dismas and the reason why that origin story is so important to me is that, Dismas House started because you had these two groups of people encounter each other. And on the part of the university students, having an open enough mind to recognize a need that this other group had, right? A need for a place to live and a need for community. So they were open-minded enough to recognize it. Then they were open-hearted enough to do something about it. And it's a simple thing. It's not sophisticated, but it's really powerful, right? And to me, the genius of Dismas is that simplicity, that what it requires to accomplish the mission of Dismas is open minds and open hearts. And it's something that anybody can do. It doesn't require, it wasn't sociology students at Vanderbilt. It was the whole gamut of students at Vanderbilt. right? It was, and then our experience has been that, it doesn't matter, what your education level is. It doesn't matter what you've been trained to do in work. If you become a part of that community life at Dismas House, you are fulfilling the mission of Dismas because you have that open heart, right?
It's just one of the interesting things you said there. And nowadays in the social services world, we're always talking about evidence-based programming and like all the research studies and pilot programs. And we look to other states that, supposedly have the best practice. And then you have something that was created in the 70s on a hunch. This needed to be done. What if we did this? What if we create family and community without any research? And it worked. Some basic needs were filled. Housing, supports.
What is the benefit of mixing the two populations, do you guys think? Students and formerly incarcerated people?
Well, to me, it's the students living in the house. It's the same thing as the volunteer cooks who come to the house. Their presence is communicating something that I think is incredibly powerful, right? Because the messages of incarceration are, you're no good, right? We need to separate you from us, right? So that where we are, you are not. So there's a division. It's a physical separation, right? Between a person who's incarcerated and their community. But then a person internalizes those messages, and we use language like convict and criminal to distinguish us from them. And as a person spends, time in prison, they internalize these messages. When it's time for them to get out, well, there was a person who lived at our house and he was interviewed, and this is the way he put it, and I think it's perfect, so I like to quote him. But he said, when I got out of prison and I first came to Dismas House, I felt like I was coming to a regular house in a regular neighborhood, but I was not a regular person, right? So that sense of alienation. Okay, so back to your question. When a student is living in the house or the volunteer cooks show up, the message is, I care enough about you that I will enter into relationship with you. So that's a message of acceptance as opposed to the messages of incarceration, which are the messages of rejection. So to me, fundamentally, the thing that we do at Dismas House is create community so that people can have those relationships where they learn that they're accepted by their community. Not surprisingly, in our mission statement, right, the key word is reconcile, right? So it's to reconcile former prisoners with society and society with former prisoners. So to reconcile is to heal a broken relationship. There's something broken about a person's relationship with their community when they commit a crime, when they become incarcerated. And then, when it's time for them to be a part of the community again, the experience living at Dismas House is one where they experience acceptance. So the student is participating in that when the student lives at the house, and the volunteer cooks are participating in that when they come to the house.
Was the original house staffed and sanctioned by Vanderbilt, or was this completely a separate entity?
Separate. All
right, so Rita, you're in Nashville. You're experiencing this. Father Jack Hickey, the original concepts.
Like I said before, we walked away not ever dreaming we would do anything in Vermont. 1984, Sister B, a Sister of Mercy, died, and at her funeral, they allowed a group to come out of prison who were musicians who played at her funeral. And the bishop was very moved by that. He called a few of us together that he had heard did prison ministry, who we were doing decisions. And in Rutland, by now, we were also training volunteers in Burlington to do the decision program in the correctional center. He said, I'd like to do something in memory of Sister B. I'd like you folks who work with the prisoners to come up with something and put in a grant proposal. So anyway, I was from Rutland. That's where my home has been. Driving home, I thought, we have a Sister of Mercy that we know that's training to be a chaplain in Connecticut. And I became the organizer, just calling these other small number of people together. We started meeting, and we thought having a chaplaincy would be perfect, to replace Sister B. And Sister B was much beloved by the prisoners. So anyway, we put the proposal in, and unfortunately it was not accepted. We had to put our heads together. I had a flip chart. We had many more people who had gathered by now, probably 15 of us, and we brainstormed. And there were all kinds of things on this list of what we might do. We had been to the Dismas house in Nashville, so it was one of the, 15 things that people were brainstorming. And the group said, of course. And they're volunteers that are working with the prisoners. Driving home from Burlington to Rutland that day, I thought, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? I mean, it's pretty awesome to think about starting a residential program when you've never done fundraising, you haven't done public speaking. There was interest, and the group had grown already. And so that really is the secret to Dismas House, is that, as Jack Hickey would say, people join in, and they do. I mean, it's made all the difference in our growth in Vermont of creating community. And Jack Hickey would come up then and help us, and he was a very tough taskmaster. It was like, faster, you got to do more, you got to get this thing going. And anyway, he became ill during this time with cancer. He was 50 or 51 years old. We just got our committees together, and we got our staff together. One of our planning committee members, Richard Gagne, he was interested. I mean, what could be better than he had a background in education. He had, deep interest in the mission.
So Father Jack Hickey came to Vermont to help establish Dismas of Vermont?
During the planning stages.
Okay.
Right, because in the earlier stages, but he was sick in the hospital like towards the latter part. And when we opened in the fall of 1986, he was like, he never came to the house when it was open because he was already in the hospital. But the spring before that, right, he and I would go do speaking things. We went around the state. So this was the first Dismas house in Vermont. And actually, the name of it was Vermont Dismas House, because we were going to be open to taking people from the whole state of Vermont.
Can I pause it right there? I don't know that we ever explained where the Dismas name came from. Why are we called Dismas?
Dismas was the name given to the good thief crucified with Christ, who asked for forgiveness. And a legend has it that Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And so that's how the students and Jack Hickey chose the name for the first house. And I think it's important to bring out that while we're an organization and homes of transition for all faiths or no faiths, it is not associated with a particular religious group.
So the name itself is a Catholic reference.
Well, it's a Christian
reference.
I would say, a biblical.
But when we birthed Dismas of Vermont, we separated from any religious affiliation. I would imagine that Jack Hickey and Vanderbilt, they did have a religious affiliation with their house.
They became, a standard 501c3 organization, which is not a specifically religious organization. There were many, church groups involved and so on. But again, in the early days, I think we probably would have described ourselves as an interfaith organization, not affiliated with any particular church. But now I think over time, we would describe ourselves more accurately as, a not specifically religious organization. But obviously that's our history. So, and with a word like reconciliation in your mission statement, reconciliation is a pretty theologically loaded word, right? So you can find religion in Dismas, but it's just not specifically religious.
I think, too, that we had excellent PR when we were opening, particularly from the Rutland Herald. There was a writer, Yvonne Daly, who recently passed away, she was very interested in the work we were doing, teaching decision-making and problem-solving. She came to a weekend of training at the Rutland Correctional Center that we put on, like perhaps a few years before we opened the Burlington House. But I was looking up some articles before this podcast, and I found like front page, top story, Burlington Dismas House to open, and she explained the whole thing.
A couple more things about Father Jack.
Sure.
So, I think I had mentioned earlier that, he was a really good preacher. And since, we hope to have university students living at the house when we first opened. So this, in the spring semester before our anticipated opening in the fall of 1986, we worked at arranging for him to speak, on campus at the University of Vermont. And he was so good. He was such a good preacher that, it seemed like after every speaking engagement, there would be at least one student who signed up
to live in the house.
And so when we opened, we had either I don't remember if it was 4 or 5 students living in the house.
We did. They were great.
There were UVM students and some Trinity College students. It was like after that, I never was able to, I did all those speaking engagements after that. It's like I was able to recruit a student every now and then, but it was amazing that it was like he would talk and it was like people would respond. It was, he had a gift and he worked at it. Like one of the things that really impressed me was, so he was over 50. And when he would preach, he would bring a little cassette things, put in a cassette and record his sermons and his speeches. And he would send it off to some other Dominican priest to get critiqued on his on his sermons and stuff. And so that was, I was always amazed by that. And then my other sort of favorite Jack Hickey story was that I had mentioned earlier that there was another Dismas house in the planning stages. They were we were getting ready to open in the fall of 1986, but the folks in Worcester were like a year out behind us.
But there was the one in South Bend that opened the same year.
Yeah. But when Father Jack would come up to spend time with us, we would take a trip to go down to Worcester to meet with their planning group. And like I said, which, were like a year behind us. And so there was someone on our planning committee, John Crabb, who owned a Saab. And he let us borrow. So I was driving like a Plymouth Horizon or something, right? So, but John let us borrow his Saab for this trip down to Worcester. And Father Jack and I would fight over who got to drive the car. So we ended up splitting. It's like you drive on the way down, I get to drive on the way back.
I was born in 1985. I very vividly remember when I was just shy of 1 year old reading in the newspaper, Burlington Dismas House opens in Vermont. Tell me about the first days of Burlington Dismas House. What was that like?
The first days, what I remember from my perspective, Richard had moved in with his family, his almost family, right? His first 2 children were born at that house.
Yeah, so Lori, was my then wife, it was our plan to live in the house. So we had an apartment in the downstairs, in the basement of the house, which is now the office. But it was, our bedroom was down there. And Lori was pregnant. Structured training program for new house directors that lasted 7 weeks. And I had to go to Nashville, and they wanted me to go for 7 weeks.
So you maintained a relationship with Nashville while you were doing this?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We were part of the Nashville organization.
Oh.
We were part of Dismas Incorporated in Nashville.
Who else did that
we were not a
include?
separate organization.
501c3. We were incorporated. I mean, we were part of Dismas Inc., part of that corporation.
Were there other states involved in Dismas Inc.?
Yes.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Well, at the same time that we started, before us and in South Bend, Indiana, we started at the same year. But before that, it was all Tennessee. When we started, there were 3 houses in Tennessee, one in Nashville, one in Maryville, Tennessee, which was on the eastern, by the Smokies, and then one in Memphis. And then, so we were houses number 4 and 5 with us in South Bend. But anyway, I went down there during the summer, and it was like they cut me some slack by saying, okay, well, we'll let you be here to do training for 6 weeks instead of 7 weeks, considering that she's pregnant.
That was nice of them.
So,
yeah.
Julia was born in November of 1986. And so Julia has the distinction of being the only child ever to live at Dismas House. She lived there for the first couple of years of her life. And it was kind of great because we had all these in-house babysitters and stuff. It worked out pretty well.
Before we get to the point of where we split from National Dismas House and Dismas Inc., Jim, do you have an idea of how National Dismas House is doing today?
Just basically what I've researched. They have they have a tiered program, it seems like to me. They have the original Dismas program. I'm not certain that it's as true to the original program as Dismas of Vermont is, but they do have a progressive program where on site, on their campus, they do have apartments that are available for individuals who are ready to make that next step. Their living arrangements progressively get less restrictive as they demonstrate their abilities to accomplish their commitments to themselves, to Dismas, and their communities.
Would you say there's still some elements that we could learn from?
I'm open to it. I think that as we look at what we're trying to do over the next 5 to 10 years, it probably would make sense for us to visit some other Dismas houses to see that how they're doing the mission. How are they helping people transition on to the next step? There might be things that we can learn from them, and there might be things that they can learn from us.
Sure.
I think the model is very different now, though, in Nashville. I think they have over 70 people living like in a high rise, and it's
like
that's
an apartment
their
complex.
second step program.
I
So
don't
there's
think
level.
they
Well,
sold the house. They don't have the Dismas
Right.
house. So I think it's quite a change.
It's different, yes,
and
absolutely.
not to say some of whatever else they're doing, but I just think the distinction is important.
It's definitely not a house as we have in Hartford or Chittenden County or Rutland County by any means.
So how do we get from one house to 5?
I'll speak to that. Honestly, I never dreamed we would have a Dismas house, let alone more than one Dismas house. In fact, in the beginning, I'd go up for 2 days, work with Richard and stay overnight and go back to Rutland. And we just had this board that came together and the community volunteer cooks and just wonderful volunteers that came forward. And so that was 1986. By 1988, I was still very involved. I was on the board and everything, but I decided to run for public office. I ran for the Vermont State Senate. And then all of a sudden, Rutland is getting excited about the Burlington Dismas House, and they want to have a Rutland Dismas House. I'm in office at this point, and so we started organizing as best we could. And again, the Decisions program was a real feeder of people that understood what goes on in prison, and they wanted to be part of this transitional home in Rutland. Except Rutland immediately, when the publicity started coming out, was very much against it. And we had found property on Route 7, and we thought it was a big house. We thought it would be a great Dismas house, but neighbors and so forth thought differently. Anyway, long story short is we found a new location closer to downtown. However, maybe a few months before we were going to open, the zoning board took up, because of neighbors' concern, that we were locating in that neighborhood. And so...
And what year was this?
1990. the zoning board voted in favor, actually, by the vote, but not by the number of seats on the board. And the way it's worded is you've got to have a majority of the seats on the board. So we won, but we lost. So we opened the Rutland House in September on time, but only with students because we had a court case. And so I went out and I went to a friend who had been a decisions volunteer, and I went to his law office and I said, Gene, we need a pro bono attorney. Can you help us? And he gulped and he just sort of sat back in his chair and he said, wow. Anyway, he took the case. It took until the May of 1991 to go to court. We got positive in late June, and we opened for the former prisoners to come to the house to join the students that were living there at the time. The letters to the editor were unbelievable, pages. I'm not exaggerating. And of course, I was in public office, so I was the bad guy, if you will. But we stuck with it. I did not run for a second term in the Senate. I knew that it's so much to run for public office day after day after day, and it's so much to go through preparing to go to court to open a Dismas house. And I'm grateful for that decision.
And where were you at this point, Richard, 1990, 1991?
On Beale Street, which is where the original Dismas house was. I was the house director there, and that was around the time that Kimberly Parsons started, who is also continuing to be a house director in Burlington. So there's one interesting story having to do with Rutland opening was that when we opened in 1986, we had to go through like a zoning hearing as well. And we had some neighbors in our neighborhood that expressed some concern, but it wasn't nearly what the experience was in Rutland. So that kind of gave us like this false impression, I think, of challenges to come in the future. But we found Burlington to be altogether a pretty accepting area. But we had like one neighbor, elderly lady, that, was kind of concerned. Here's a bunch of people coming out of prison going to be her neighbors. And so, but, we were open like 3 to 4 years now by the time Rutland was opening up. And given the concerns that the neighbors were expressing, Rita asked me to see if I would go talk to her and see if she would like write a letter in support of Dismas that they could use in Rutland. So I did, and she was happy to do it. And the thing is, like where we are in Burlington, it's mostly, it's the kind of neighborhood that has changed over time. It used to be families and stuff, but now it's mostly students. So the interesting thing was, and this is what she put in her letter, and I don't remember it obviously exactly, because this is like 30 years ago, but basically she says, I have two kinds of neighbors. I have these, bright, motivated university students for neighbors, and I've got these guys coming out of prison for neighbors, and I much prefer the latter. And basically the message was, you won't be sorry if Dismas House is your neighbor. So that was a pretty neat story.
And I think also the zoning board in Burlington limited the number of cars we could have because there were so many students around with cars, and Burlington's got too many cars, and so that was.
So parking has always been an issue in Burlington.
Well, but the thing was, they limited the number of cars. It wasn't anything like going through a court case because they don't want you in the neighborhood.
So we have one Burlington house, one Rutland house, and then the second Burlington house?
Yeah, the next house to open up would be many years later, in 2008.
Oh, I had no idea it was that.
We opened the house in Winooski. So we changed the name. The house on Buell Street was called Vermont Dismas House all the time, even when Rutland was open. We kept that name Vermont Dismas House until we opened the house in Winooski, and then we decided to name them after the street. So we had Buell Street Dismas and East Allen Dismas together made up the community called Burlington Dismas House. So that's the third house. And then,
The fourth
a couple of years after that, Rita,
Right.
you worked mostly with the Hartford folks.
Yeah, by now, I didn't tell you my little journey, which is kind of interesting too. We opened the Rutland House unexpectedly with the court case. I volunteered to be the first house director. And so someone else on the board became the president of the board, which I had been previous to that. It was an amazing experience, but I went from being Richard's overseer, if you will, to
Boss.
him.
You can say boss.
to him then giving me training. I did all the training reports, but I learned so much by going in and being a house director. I've never had any experience like that in my life. It helped me because then I became a regional director for Dismas Inc. in Nashville. So I worked with the Northeast, but also they would send me to Albuquerque where they had a house. And then from there, I don't know whether, like in 2008, we opened the Winooski House, but then, well, you know what we're bypassing? We're bypassing the whole part of when Dismas Inc.
That was my next question. When did we separate?
Well, I just wanted to touch on one point that Rita was making that I don't know, maybe this is happens more commonly than I think, but I think one of the interesting things that happened was that, when I was the house director in Burlington, Rita was basically my boss. She was the chair, like the president of the board. And so basically was my boss. Then she became a house director and I became her boss. And then she became a regional director and became my boss again. So we just went back and forth like that. And it was like, it was fine.
It was
It's unique.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so at what point did we separate from Dismas Inc. in Nashville?
So what was happening was that Jack Hickey died right after we opened the Burlington House. It was January, and he was 51 years old. And others in Nashville then were the main people in the office of Dismas Inc., the executive director, program director. But he had such charisma that there were many houses. There were 11 houses eventually that opened in Tennessee. We had good people remaining in the office there who did as best they could, but some of the local houses were not raising appropriate money, not having appropriate boards. And so all of our belongings, everything was owned in common because we were Dismas Inc. So the Board of Trust of Dismas Inc. made a decision that if local houses chose to incorporate on their own, we would have their blessing. So that was the year 2000. And it was very scary, but we knew we had to do it. We were grateful, so grateful to Nashville. But we knew we needed to stand on our own 2 feet. So that was a very big challenge, I think.
In terms of that transition. Well, breaking up is never easy, right? It was painful because you were severing a relationship, that, in some ways, it was okay. I mean, everybody was adult about it. But it was still, there were some hard feelings and stuff about people who wanted to go. And it's like, oh, you're tearing down the organization. And it was not easy.
You're talking the national organization now. The Vermont organization was always in sync, I think.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Sure.
And did you feel prepared from the experience to be independent?
Yes. Yeah, we had been open for...
It was more of a sadness, I think, than we had such good people on our own local boards and good advisors, and definitely, the people that were there no matter what, long-termers, that supported us. So,
and because the organization was headquartered in Nashville, we would end up going to meetings in Nashville quite regularly. The staff and the people from the local boards of directors from the different houses would end up going down there. And I missed going to Nashville after we stopped. It was like, oh man, we had a lot of good times going down to Nashville.
We did.
So we're at year 2000 now. We have 2 more houses left to open.
All right. So by now I was...
Actually, can I just because this is going back in history. Another thing that Rita didn't mention, because of course she probably wouldn't mention it, so I will. And I don't remember the exact year, but it was in those early years that Rita was named...
1986.
It was named the Mother of the Year for Vermont. And then that same Vermont Mother of the Year became the National Mother of the Year.
And you never stopped.
No, I have to tell you, though, it was Eileen McGinley from Burlington, who wasn't a board member, but she came to our board meetings. And somehow she had something to do with the Vermont Mothers. And so as we were opening the Burlington house, I think it was October, and Eileen was at the meeting and she said, we should have Rita nominated to be Mother of the Year in Vermont because it would give more publicity to Dismas. And I'm like, what? And
what credentials do you need for this award?
Well, anyway, I did it, and it was awkward. I believe all mothers are Mothers of the Year. And when I got, the call or whatever, I was like, oh my gosh. And then they told me that the national convention was in Lexington, Kentucky. I'd grown up in Lexington, Massachusetts. So I thought, that's kind of fascinating. And when I went out and I met all the people, I was terrified because we had to give a 3-minute speech. And of course, you know what I talked about? I talked about Dismas House being family and my own family. But I think it was Dismas that really probably had the judges choose me. So it was a huge surprise in my life.
And then Rita went on an international speaking tour.
Wow. I mean, I think you got to take some credit, right? It's been clear to me, and I've only been around you for 2.5 years now, that most things that you touch, Rita, become pretty great and impressive.
No, people feel sorry for me, honestly, because there's so much help that I need. And I'll say, can you help me? Can you help me?
I don't know about that.
No, it's true. Richard will tell you.
Well, actually, I think Dismas, there's a lot of organizations that start out like this small ragtag group of people, and some make it and some don't, and it's like, what's the magic thing, or why do some survive and prosper and others fold after a couple of years? And I think, and this is just my take on it, but I think there were basically 4 people who were pretty integral to the organization for whatever 20, 30 years. Rita and Frank. Rita's husband, Frank, who was a judge, and then myself and Kimberly, who were staff people, all these years as well. And I think we each brought different kind of gifts to the organization that I think were really essential and helpful to the long-term survivability of the organization. Rita is like the classic founder person. She has the charisma to draw people in. And I think that's what a founder needs to be able to do, is to gather people. And for most years, in the organization, if you go to a large gathering of Dismas people and you ask them about how did you come to be a part of Dismas, it would be Rita. It wasn't like Richard and Kimberly, and it wasn't like this even spread. It was Rita, right? Because that was Rita's gift as a founder, and Frank's gift, I think, was was providing that kind of like board leadership. He was the leader of Dismas Inc., and he was a leader in terms of like board leadership. And so he had that kind of gravitas that you want from, that kind of leader. Kimberly had like the entrepreneurial, she grew up in a family that ran a business. And so she had a business mind and always thought about the business angle of things and what made sense business-wise for us. And I think that was essential too. And for myself, I was always the person who thought about, what the mission is and how we create like what we do in the program to match the mission. Right, and create the structure of, and so I was perfectly placed as a house director to make that happen. But I think it was a perfect marriage of all these like gifts that the four of us had, and then us, and the four of us sort of being around all this time, led to the organization being able to prosper and be stable. And
Rita, I have to tell you, I had no idea for years. I had no idea that Frank was involved in Dismas at all. I had no idea that he was a judge. He always introduced himself as Rita's driver.
Well, see, that's what I wanted to mention after Richard was talking about, president of Dismas Inc. And if you had in your mind what I have in my mind, he was always stuffing envelopes in the background. He was the wind behind my sails. He just did grunt work. He just did whatever needed to be done. And he was a fairly simple person.
Yeah, I remember he used to color in coloring books with my daughter at board meetings in the background while we all did our thing. I had no idea there's all this history there. Right. Nobody tells you these things unless you ask.
But that's partly what, made him such a great human being. He had the gift to be a leader, but he was incredibly humble. And exactly like what Rita, like when we had, in those very early days, Rita and Frank lived in Rutland, but they were starting this Dismas house in the Burlington area because Burlington was the largest city in Vermont and stuff. So
well,
it was
the people were up there too, the volunteers.
Yeah, but it was always Rita and Frank who drove up, and Frank was Rita's driver. Who it was like I got that same impression, but then obviously over the years, Frank's role. And then, of course, the other famous image of Frank is wearing the blue gloves. Rubber gloves, because when we would meet down in Weston, and that's a whole other part of the story that we didn't really touch on, are the brothers at Weston Priory. But once a year, we would all go down and basically have a weekend retreat down at Weston Priory. And, Frank would be in the kitchen washing the dishes after dinner. He'd have these big gloves on and stuff. And it was just like this classic image of Frank.
And I think for those annual retreats, it would be house directors and local boards, which are now councils, maybe 30 or 40 of us, and so it's been a beautiful experience, and I think Richard touching on the four of us, you don't realize the years pass, but you don't realize the four of us, were together for so long.
All right, let's open up my pride and joy, the Hartford House. How'd that happen?
Okay, so I was contacted by a group that worked for the state of Vermont, and part of their work was transitioning women out of prison. And so they invited me to come over to talk about Dismas House. And so when I went over, it was like I had a video and, we had questions and answers. There wasn't a lot of interest because there were men and women. They wanted something just for women, except one of the women that was there said, well, I'd like to go visit the Rutland Dismas House. Would anyone else like to come? And at the time, she wasn't director of the Haven, but she became director of the Haven. And the two that went to the Rutland House, anyway, came back much more enthusiastic, visiting staff, seeing the evening meal. That was 2010, and it was not until 2014 that we opened. We had a court case in Hartford, and it delayed us a year from opening. Once we opened in 2014, I think the community and neighbors of Hartford Dismas House saw that we were a good part of the neighborhood. We were a good complement, and we had neighbors that were very much in favor of our locating there. Some who joined our board in Hartford, but there was one group that was, opposed. So I just, with that particular court case, I knew we would win the case. It wasn't so in Rutland. That was very contentious. The Haven gave us a lot of space to meet because we didn't have a meeting place once we were going to court. We couldn't meet in the regular downtown office building that was part of Hartford. So we have had a really good relationship with the Haven, which we treasure.
All right, which brings us to the final house. This is a story for you to tell, Jim. How do we get a women's Dismas house?
That, I think, was the aligning of stars in the most magical way. I would say that, to go as far as say that I had a lot to do with making that happen, I would say that's not true. I just happened to be the catalyst. And that came to be really, I had been working for Dismas for about a year now, or almost a year, the height of COVID. And I think it was December 2020, I get a phone call from Eric McGuire, the Rutland Dismas House director, and saying, hey, Jim, I need you to come down here tomorrow and look at this house that Caprice has got us looking at. And so Caprice Hoover, a good friend of mine from back in my United Way days, who was the executive director of the United Way of Rutland County at that time, identified this property that was owned by the Rutland Housing Trust. And so I cleared my schedule, hopped in my car, we drove down the next day, and if I wasn't worried about getting fired by the board, I would have cut the check for that house that day. But I didn't. But I did very much so push and gather information and gather stuff together to be able to make a presentation to the board so that we could react to a need in the community. What was going on in the state of Vermont, and specifically in the Rutland County during that time, which doesn't seem all that long ago, is people were being relocated to hotels. People were being released from prison directly to hotels without any supervision or supports. There was just a real need for a place for women coming out of incarceration. We had a number of other transitional housing programs specifically for women throughout the state. Those all shut down with the loss of their grant with the Department of Corrections. And we reacted to a need that needed to happen, and we found the perfect house that was the right color blue and the right color yellow, like all our Dismas houses. And we made a move, and very much, or many thanks really to Alan Sullivan, who was then the Dismas of Vermont board president at that time. He was really looking for a project like that, and so he was pushing me to find something, and then something. Honestly, I say it fell in my lap, and it was just right. It was just the right facility. The board and I had our first in-person meeting since 2020 at that house 2 weeks ago, and it's amazing.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, the group of people that are living there right now, they are ultimately what we expect to be in a Dismas house. They are a community with all their faults and all their successes. They're there together and they're doing it together.
As we're wrapping things up here, I just want to go around the table one last time and give everybody a chance to speak to their vision. Where would they like to see? What's next for Dismas?
For myself, as an organization, we're moving to a period of time where we're going to be beyond the people who've been around since the beginning, right? And so I think that's a significant transition for the organization. And I guess my hope is that, while, those kinds of transitions bring inevitable change, I hope that there is, something from that original vision of Dismas that is maintained and stays a part of, what it is to be a Dismas house, or to, for a person living at Dismas house or volunteering at Dismas house, that they still will get those same, have that same kind of experience.
Our secret to success those beginning years was to not grow too quickly. And I think we had Burlington and we had excellent staffing, and then we had Rutland. But, it just took time to grow into maintaining these houses, to keeping them solid, helpful homes. I think as we're growing again with the women's house, which is a very different experience because, like Jim said, it kind of fell in our laps that, we didn't have to buy a house, we could rent a house. So my hope is that we will be able to help people leaving Dismas house to transition into successful living. And I know that there are things that the board is considering, and I just know that we just have to take everything into account. Like Richard is saying, we have, 2 staff people that will be retiring in the next few years, and God only knows how long I'm going to live, but I'm not really so much a part of that, equation anymore. But I guess I'll pass to Jim.
I would want to keep as much as the original program in place as it has always been, and then build off of that and build next steps. Well, still including, I think it was mentioned earlier that, talking about going on retreats with 40 volunteers and staff, that volunteer list is over 55 between all the local councils and board members and committed members. That is Dismas's power. I would say the community dinners is the secret sauce. And between those two, that creates real community. And we need to keep that, and we need to grow that. And we need to stay as true to ourselves as we possibly can while trying to find the next step and work in a world or in a housing environment that's not equitable to everybody, regardless if you've been incarcerated or not. And that's really what our focus is. But to the point of what you were saying, Richard, is we are in that first stage of trying to get there. And the first stage was that staffing support and making sure we are able to keep the structure that we need and that support there, as well as preserve as much knowledge that Richard and Kim and Rita bring with them to the table. That's 36 times 3, 36 years times 3. That's a lot of knowledge, and that's a lot of experience. And if we forget that, or if we move too far away from that, we won't really be a Dismas house anymore.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Going to Dismas. Learn more about Dismas of Vermont at dismasofvt.org.
Thank you for listening to this Jam podcast. If you have found this program interesting and would like to find more Upper Valley content or learn how to produce your own media, please visit us at uvjam.org.